Oh, welcome. We are so glad you're joining us for this Unite for Sight webinar. Unite for Sight has been kind enough to pull together a really amazing group of experts to discuss a particular topic that is important for all of us, and that's leading and following with humility and integrity. My name is Marie Martin. I'm the Associate Director of Education and Training at the Vanderbilt Institute for Global Health. My role today is to be one of a facilitator, really looking forward to an engaging and rich discussion on the topic. We'll ask each of our three panelists to give a short introduction with their background, their role currently, and then we'll launch into conversations about these really important topics and how we can apply and integrate them collectively in our work in global health. So Andrea, I'll start with you. If you could give an introduction and move us into this rich discussion.
Thank you very much, Marie, and delighted to be invited today. Thank you so much. Yes, my name is Andrea Coleman. I'm the co-founder of Riders for Health. Riders for Health, health focus is really on making sure that the transport that health is used in Africa is well run and well managed. And I have a bit of a hobby horse about maintenance because I think maintenance is critical to all sorts of things, a great employer in Africa. So that's one of my ideas, thoughts. And I've also recently founded an organization, fundraising entity, so that the African leadership, the true leaders of from now on. So that's all.
Thank you. You're breaking up a little bit. The countryside in the UK sometimes is remote to access, but hopefully we'll be able to really engage despite any bandwidth issues. So Sten, why don't I pass the floor over to you?
My name is Sten Vermond. I am a pediatrician and infectious disease epidemiologist. I've worked in the US on a variety of issues, usually infection control, but most of my career has been global. And my current position is as Dean of the Yale School of Public Health.
Wonderful. Richard.
Well, my name is, first, thank you very much. I'm greatly honored by the opportunity to join such a talented and gracious group of people today. My name is Richard Skolnick. I am now mostly a grandfather, but at the same time, I continue to maintain the authorship of an introductory college textbook called Global Health 101. I'm working now on a primer on global health for healthcare professionals. And at the same time, the Yale School of Public Health and the Dean have been gracious enough to continue involving me both in an online course that I have and in some advising and guest teaching. In my earlier lives, I was the Regional Director for Health for the South Asia region at the World Bank, the Executive Director of the Harvard PEPFAR program for AIDS treatment in 3 countries in Africa, and then moved on to being both a practitioner in global health and a global health educator.
Wonderful. So as you can see, we have really a distinguished panel that bring together broad expertise and niches that I think will be realized and commonalities, especially as we think about leading and following. So as we intend this to be more of a discussion, I have a number of prompts that we'll use, but we will likely take different, maybe well-traveled or not well-traveled paths down these topical areas and welcome any comments from the audience. So should you like to include a question in our conversation, we'll do our best to bring those into the discussion. Feel free to type those in through your online portal. So why don't I start, and with no one intended to be the first, so you can jump in as we engage, around what is leadership? And how might we define it? So in particular, we know that leaders can really be vital or in moving programs forward or in undermining them. And certainly when we think about leadership, it's important to imagine it in the context where we work. So I'll ask broadly to all three panelists, have you developed your own philosophy of leadership? And what forces in your life maybe helped you develop that? Did you study leadership? Were you influenced by good or bad leaders? Were there other forces that really compelled you to develop what you utilize today?
Maybe I can. Please, Marie, please tell me if I'm breaking up, because I know that's very annoying. And then when you tell me to that, I'll stop.
Wonderful.
My own feeling about leadership, right from the beginning of our organization, has really been, I think, very. I've learned a lot. I can see this is maybe breaking up, but I've learned a lot and become less, I think, much more sophisticated in my views. But in the very first place, I felt it was really to set direction of our organization, because it was new. Nobody had ever done transport for health delivery before. To set the culture of the organization and to make sure that it was leadership, in my opinion, is to enable people, not to tell them what to do, but to enable them to come forward with their views and ideas within a broad strategy, but also for that leadership to set the culture. And I think that is a vital piece of leadership.
Wonderful. Thank you, Andrea. And you were breaking up a little bit. I think we got your important points. It might be worth trying turning your video off so that we can hear your really important words of wisdom, and we'll let you know if that continues to be an issue. But really important in thinking about leadership and how it changes over time as we gain more experiences and learn from the opportunities around us. So Sten or Richard?
Well, I'll be happy to take a stab at that important question. I was in an orchestra for many years as a violinist, not particularly talented one, but I enjoyed it immensely all through my childhood and my college years. And I was struck by the position of the concertmaster and the position of the conductor. And I think often a leader is like a conductor. It's very helpful when they can play one or more of the instruments. Then they have some sympathy and synergy with their colleagues, and they also have seen it from the other end. So working one's way up through the system and having institutional memory about how an organization functions can be very helpful. But then the conductor has to be willing to have the soloists and the musicians take the bow and be highlighted. And one needs a conductor who is thinking about the outcome of the music, not credit. And I feel like leaders are looking at the end game. What is the product or the service that they are trying to provide, and keeping a razor focus on the quality and availability and value and equity of that product. I think it was this team, Heifetz and Lowry, who published something about being on a balcony, and you oversee everything that's going on, but you don't take credit for it all. One of our great leaders said, "You can get a lot done if you don't care who gets the credit." And ultimately, if one can maintain one's integrity and advocate for a culture that is respectful, a culture in which people treat one another well, and one can lead by example in that regard. One can have good outcomes and good process. So those are just some thoughts. You asked earlier if we'd ever been trained. I did have the good fortune of getting leadership and management training when I went to the National Institutes of Health as a branch chief back in 1988, a long time ago. I guess I was about 34 years old. And I was one of the younger branch chiefs and had not had a major leadership role. And I found the training very helpful. They put us through paces of thinking through the difference between management and leadership and how they were related, but not the same thing, and sort of Peter Drucker classic training. And I found it terribly helpful. I remember one time going to a session on how to deal with unhappy employees and how to evaluate circumstances. And I remember a eureka moment where in the training, I realized that I had a physician whom I had assigned to do complex tasks that would take 2 weeks of research to operationalize an answer. And I had a nurse with an MPH who I had doing the quick response things. And when I learned a little bit more about how personality drives functioning, I realized that I was exactly reversing what each of them would be happiest doing. The physician had been head of a major international agency, and he was used to quick decisions, moving things with sort of emergency response. The nurse was a very careful and thoughtful researcher. And her comfort zone was a deep dive, get it right, and move it forward. So I literally swapped my assignments for the two of them starting the next day, and it made a huge, huge difference. Now, I know that's sort of a management example, but I think the leadership message there was that I got training, I learned from the training, and I was willing to apply the training.
Excellent. So, so really symbolic of good leadership in action. I can say Sten used to be my leader at the Vanderbilt Institute for Global Health. So it's fun to think about these conversations in light of experiences that I had as well as a leader. And Richard, we've had conversations about leadership through Unite for Sight conferences and really fantastic opportunities to share a platform of a webinar. So thoughts that you would share, and even if some that Sten and Andrea mentioned were relevant, would be really interested to hear your contribution.
Great. Thank you very much. And I promise the audience that I've learned much more from Marie, my interactions with Marie, that she's learned with me, and I've really treasured them and have an enormously high regard for her. And I'm humbled by the thoughtful comments of both Sten and Andrea, and I will, as Marie has encouraged me to do, build on them. You know, my sense of leadership is that a leader is someone who helps to identify, articulate, and build a consensus around the end game, as Sten has said, where it is one wants to go. And then, as Andrea and Sten both said very well, someone who helps to create a process that enables the team of people to help get to that point as rapidly, as effectively, and efficiently as possible. And as Sten has said, I do think this is a lot like conducting. A violinist can play over here unless they're as good as Jascha Heifetz, or a cellist over here, and they're an instrument. But the difference between an instrument and an orchestra, and between an actor in global health and a team moving in the same direction, is I think someone who needs to help put this together in a way that 2 + 2 is 5, instead of 2 + 2 being 3. And I've worked for leaders for whom 2 + 2 is 2, and sometimes 1. But the leaders from whom I learned the most were those who created a process. And I used to say that a good leader is someone who makes and who creates the kind of environment, as Andrea and Sten has said, which makes people wake up in the morning and desire nothing more than to go work toward the achievement of that goal. And if I were doing assessments of leaders, I would ask one simple question if I were in human resources. What is the extent to which your leader manager makes you feel that you just are dying every morning to get up, go to work, and do all that you can to help to achieve the strategic outcome that your team has agreed on? And finally, I think it's really important that these goals be set strategically. The last thing I would say, forgive me, is unlike Sten, I'm pretty intransigent and I'm not such a good learner. I was forced over my many years as a manager at the World Bank to attend a range of management training programs. At one of them, in a compulsory management training volleyball game for team building, I tore my Achilles tendon. The good news about that was it was covered by a national insurance scheme because it was a compulsory volleyball game. At another program, I was forced to attend one of America's finest business schools for 6 weeks. And I must say, I hated every minute of it. I thought the business school teachers were just promoting one fad after another. And the people, and I must say, to the extent that I have embodied management or leadership skills that my colleagues would have appreciated, I would say I am most grateful to the mentors that I've had. I think throughout life, and I still send things to my mentors, even some of them are 85, 86, 87 years old now. I think much of what I have become that's good, if there is any, has to do with the very, very thoughtful people with whom I worked. And the lessons I learned from watching the ways in which they behaved, and the lessons I learned from the thoughtful comments and critiques that they regularly provided me about my own work. And I can remember to this day when one of my managers came in and he said, I think you're on the right track. Here's some few tips about becoming a little more strategic that I think can put you into the even bigger right track. And let me know if I can help you to do that even better. It was from these people throughout, almost 50 years of work that I think I owe them the most for enabling what I hope are some good leadership and management skills in myself.
Fantastic. Thank you, Richard. That was so thoughtful and pulled together, I think, some of the really important pieces of this conversation. It's nice to actually end on mentorship, to think about the role of those who have enabled us to be better versions of ourselves, maybe also provided poor examples that we might right size our own decisions around. But I wonder for you all at your stages in your career, how do you cultivate leadership in those around you? Those who are the next generation of leaders or of followers, and we can certainly scratch the surface of the difference between the two, and how you might think about, Sten, you mentioned training. Richard, you mentioned no training, but maybe more practical application, or some hybrid. And that's obviously a simple spectrum, if you will. But wonder how you all cultivate leadership in those that you work with or those that you guide.
I've switched my video off so that we hope this will help. Yes, I have the great privilege at this time to support the African leadership of this health 30 years ago. One each program was run and managed the country in which the program is based, and also to make sure that women leaders are developed as much. It's Transport for Public Health organization, that we shouldn't bring a gender imbalance into that regard. So I think that helped with in the first place. But of course, because those leaders are all respected and thought highly of by the ministries of health and the other health focused organizations with whom they partner, their own leadership styles. And it's so interesting for me. We have programs in 5 African countries, and it's very interesting to see their different leadership styles, but all of them without fail are all humble and all have great integrity, and the way that they discuss things with each other. And I've learned a huge amount from them. And I think there was a point when Riders for Health was probably 28 years old, that I felt there was a real, that I was really creating, I didn't really know how to face transition or any kind of failure. I really felt that that was something I needed to deal with and to face. And I felt that the leaders in the Africa programs really helped me through that. So I was able to listen to them, look at them, and help me through those times. So I think it's another thing that leaders have to think about. How do they set an example of dealing with their own movement through transition or failure? So I learned a huge amount, and I think leaders have to learn how to learn.
Wonderful, really thoughtful. And actually, I think it did help that your video was off when you're talking. I think we got more of your messages about gender inclusion, humility, integrity, the importance of learning from others, and wondered, Sten and Richard, what your thoughts are, in particular about failure. Not that you have failed. I remember my husband being asked to speak specifically on failure at Vanderbilt, and he said, why did they ask me to talk about failure? But a really important opportunity to think about how we learn from failure, embrace it, and think about that as we're cultivating leadership skills in others.
Failure is part of growth in life. We all are failing. If we don't fail, we've taken no risk, and I'm not sure that's the way one wants to live life. So I have a long list of failures that I could go through that I don't intend to bore your audience with, but I will say that I've developed a kind of an attitude that I want to learn every single day. Every single day, I want to be able to do better tomorrow than I did yesterday. And that's been a helpful attitude because it keeps me reasonably modest and humble, because I'm thinking about continuous quality improvement of me. And that does help me learn from my mistakes compared to getting all defensive or getting all bent out of shape, blaming others and that sort of thing. So I think that's been a good general attitude, is always trying to improve my own performance, my own behavior. Now, vis-a-vis how to mentor at leadership in others, there are philosophers who say that leadership can't be nurtured, but I'm not one of them. I think it can be nurtured. And I think it's often nurtured by example. So I will tend to talk through an issue if I'm seeing a direction that may not be optimal from my point of view. And rather than be sort of instinctive and authoritarian leader who simply redirects the group and goes a different way, I'll talk it through with the group so that people will understand why I'm seeing it from a different point of view. Because that then gains the rebuttal advantage, maybe because I did high school debate. Then my colleagues can say, oh, we agree with you, we see it your way. Or they can say, no, you haven't thought about this. So then together we figure out the right path. And maybe I'm the final decision maker, but I like it when we can manage this by consensus, because we generally get better decisions than if I just make a decision. So in that process, I think that the people in the room are seeing a leadership style which will serve them well. I've been in really three worlds. I've been in government service at the NIH for 6 years. I was on the extramural side of NIH, which means that I was managing grants. I was not being paid to do research, but I was being paid to manage others doing research. So it had a substantial, I had a $50 million budget, which back in 1988 was a lot of money. And so that was a tremendous responsibility. And then I had my academic life, but I've also had my NGO life, working on developing 2 NGOs in Africa. And I've seen that kind of style work well in all 3 settings. That whether it was government, or whether it was an NGO in Africa, or whether it was academia, this consultative management style often is more successful. And I'm not saying that occasionally the decision maker doesn't have to just make a decision because the circumstances are such that there is no alternative, but you can at least have the courtesy to explain that and walk people through the logic.
Great, really thoughtful. And Richard.
So again, I'm humbled and appreciative of the very thoughtful comments that both Stan and Andrea have made, but perhaps I can add just a little bit to them. As I mentioned, I'm a big believer, as Stan has mentioned as well, of learning by example. And so in my later years as a global health educator mostly, one of the things I did was add to my textbook a chapter on profiles of global health actors. And my goal in doing that was to provide students interested in global health, and many of whom will pursue careers in global health, with people who modeled behaviors that can encourage and inspire them and from whom they can learn. Just yesterday, for example, I taught in the last 2 days virtually 4 classes to middle schoolers in Los Alamos County, New Mexico, where I now live. And I taught them the history of polio in America and the lessons of that experience for COVID-19. And I said to one of the middle schoolers, and when Jim Grant, the great head of UNICEF, went to El Salvador and found that there was a civil war, in the middle of a civil war, and asked his staff, how is El Salvador doing on vaccination? And the staff, apparently raised their arms and said, well, not great, there's a civil war. I said, what do you think that Mr. Grant said, knowing that Mr. Grant was regarded in many ways as a great and visionary leader? 1 or 2 of the students raised some thoughtful comments, and I said, think like a leader. And one of the students immediately said, I bet you Mr. Grant said, pardon my language, stop the damn war and immunize the kids. So I think there's an enormous amount to be learned from people who have distinguished themselves by their ability to help identify end goals, create enabling processes, focus obsessively on the achievement of those outcomes, and create processes that really make people want to participate and feel like they have a say. If I may, just a couple of other things. I think another characteristic of a real leader, and I see that in our governor in New Mexico, is an appreciation for just what one doesn't know, an appreciation for how limited our own knowledge is, as Stan has said, although I think Stan's being way too modest, and I know you agree, Marie. And the overwhelming desire to ensure that one has on one's team the very best people possible at all times, that one appreciates their talents, that one revels in their expertise, and that one, as Stan has said very, very well, never seeks credit, but in fact really does what they can to be sure that these great talents together can make 2 + 2 = 6 or 7 or 8, and the higher you get, the better it is. The failures to do that, I think, are among the most critical failures of all leadership. Lastly, if I may, I was very fortunate once and saw Robert McNamara attend a showing for World Bank retirees of The Fog of War. And I believe he was sincere when people asked him, what was the single most important lesson you learned about Vietnam? And he said, the most important lesson was always question your fundamental assumptions. And I think this is really critical for leaders as well. Mr. McNamara said he was sitting around with David Halberstam, called the best and the brightest minds in America. But because of the times, everybody deeply believed that if Vietnam fell, the Chi-Coms, the Chinese communists, would take over all of Southeast Asia and America would be next. Mr. McNamara was a man of great brilliance, but who was so smart and so strong, he, quite frankly, made many people, except me, which is another story, afraid to speak out. Mr. McNamara said, I realized much too late that at no time did I ever turn to these best and the brightest and say, is it possible that we are wrong? Is it possible our assumptions are incorrect? Is it possible this is just another effort by the Vietnamese to regain national sovereignty as they did when they defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu? And I think this is a really critical and fundamental lesson as one seeks to act strategically, think strategically, enable people to move forward, is never be bound by what you know, and create an environment which enables people, as Stan and Andrea said, to take risk and understand that they'll be rewarded for the lessons, whether they come from failure or success.
Really, really fantastic vignette that highlights so many things. In particular, when we're thinking about integrity, leading with integrity, asking questions around what integrity is, how you are driven by it, how humility also informs your leadership. You all have touched on that in such beautiful ways. And I wonder if we could expound on that and think about how that might look different in a global context or not, and maybe what unique challenges or opportunities exist when we think about leading with integrity and humility. So if we could do a deeper dive into those two concepts and how those are incorporated or challenged by different contexts, that would be really fantastic.
Andrea's turn.
Yes, this is the sign. I love it.
Thank you both. This is a real joy for me. Thank you all. I feel that it's often in any given moment when people are to think about what actually integrity is, and I find it much easier in a way to think about respect, which I think leads me to work with integrity. But I think to be able to think about the people around you that I'm going to whose lives I'm going to affect, whose careers, whose path through. You know, in our work, we're always thinking about what the humanitarian outcome must be, and sometimes people's jobs are very far from the outcome of seeing a community, a vulnerable community. But nevertheless, it's important as a leader to think about how to make sure you're respecting the outcome, respecting your colleagues, and making sure you believe in and respect the purpose of what you're doing, what you're all doing together. So I find the respect a much more easy pathway to integrity, but also I feel it comes naturally to some people and not to others. But at the same time, I think often people who are naturally humble, sometimes people can take that as a weakness. So there needs to be some work done for any leadership to think about how do you make sure that you don't appear weak. And I think both integrity and getting the job done where something lose your integrity. So there's that tension, and then so I'll just leave it there for the two wisest people I've heard for a long time.
Wonderful. Well, that sounds like an opening to you, Sten and Richard. Thanks, Andrea, for the.
Yeah, integrity is an interesting point. There's so many examples I have in my career because academia is not necessarily reflecting all of the theoretical principles of higher education all of the time. Especially in the research arena, people can be quite competitive and mutually unsupportive if the circumstances are not optimized. So I do believe that integrity involves trying to take the high road. And even if behavior around you is not what you would support, try always to maintain your own moral compass and not be influenced by negative peer pressures or competitive pressures that have you doing something that you don't believe in. And the business world is similar. There are many opportunities to do the wrong thing for the right reason. You know, the right reason being you think it's advancing your career or the interests of your company. Similarly, somebody in academia thinks that it's advancing their career or their unit in academia. But if it's the wrong process and the wrong moral compass, it comes back to haunt you at the end. And I have seen examples of this time and time again, where I might have made a decision that I believe was the morally right decision. I did not, in the short term, benefit from that. Somebody else benefited. But in the long run, I was always better off. And I'm not saying that, you know, luck doesn't have something to do with it, but insofar as we can be masters of our own destiny, if we're able to forge an ethical path for our careers and not deviate from that path, most people I've seen take that path have ultimately benefited from those principles. And I have seen people take shortcuts, and I've seen people literally trash their own reputations. And for what? I've not seen good come of it at the end of the day. Maybe some transient fame, maybe some transient benefits, economic or academic or whatever, but at the end of the day, taking the wrong path will have a price. I know I sound like a preacher. Sorry. Richard, fix what I just said.
Stan, weren't you the son of a preacher? You are the son.
I was the son of a gun.
And this was in Minnesota too, right? So, again, there's little that I can offer to the extraordinarily thoughtful comments of Andrea and Stan, but I'll try since Maria is insisting. You know, I think, as Stan has said much better than I could, I've always thought that if you don't have integrity, you have nothing at all. So I'm going to speak, you know, as a former technocrat, because that's how I spent most of my life. And I think they're the most important lesson, and one I've always tried to impart to my colleagues and students is, do your work to the highest level of professional quality, with the highest levels of honesty and integrity, taking maximum account of evidence, etc. And then speak the truth about your findings to the powers that be. Let the powers that be, if they wish, distort the truth or use it to take a path other than the one that you've suggested. But never go in and tell them what you think they want to hear. You, I think, as a technocrat or as a scientist or as the leader of a philanthropy or as a development person, have the obligation to be true to yourself, to be true to evidence, to be true to science, to be true to scientific principles, and speak the truth at all times. Now, in a technocracy, you might wind up without a job. You might wind up without the job that you want. But I still think one should never deviate from that, and that one will always be better off, as Sten has also suggested, by taking that route. If I may just, in terms of humility, once I like to tell students, once you leave your home, where you're probably fairly expert at who you are and who your family are, then you immediately begin to operate in a completely different domain in which your ignorance is probably greater than your knowledge. And when you expand that to development work or global health work, and you're working in multicultural environments, you have to begin at all times with the assumption that, I might be able out of affection to speak Liberian English. And there aren't a whole lot of people in the world who have a greater appreciation for and affection for the Liberian people than I do. But I don't speak a Liberian language. I might have been there 35 times. I have many friends there. I'm a student of their culture and civilization and history. I can't possibly know what my Liberian friends know about their own history, their own culture, and their own people. And in principle, if I have any value as a development agent in working with my Liberian friends or any friends in any country, it's the idea that I've been lucky enough to work on 25 or 30 countries. I've been able to work with people of the talents of Andrea and Sten on a regular basis. And therefore, I've learned to synthesize information across and findings across countries, across cultures, across political settings. And therefore, if my Liberian friends say, Richard, I heard the Rwandans did something really good, but we haven't had a chance to go. I understand you know well what they've been doing. Can you tell us more? And knowing us as you do, but not being one of us, can you help us think about maybe what that means in our environment? I think it's absolutely critical that on the one hand, you try to become a broker of information in ways that always reflect profound respect, both for what you don't know and for what your friends do know. And I think in that way, there's a possibility that if you, act with integrity, appreciate extraordinarily what you don't know, but try to add values in a world where increasingly we're going to depend on the cooperative sharing of information and learning across nations and civilizations, then I think there's some real hope that at the end of the day, your Liberian friends might say, you don't speak Basa, you don't speak Kron, you're not one of us, but you're a good friend. And that was really helpful. And we think we can take that and do something. And if you could also now introduce us to your Rwandan friends, that would be really great. So I think these are fundamental to one's possibilities of actually adding value in a way that helps to achieve outcomes, despite one's ignorance, despite one's lack of understanding. I think there's still some possibility one can do good work and make the world a better place.
Fantastic. As someone who shares your love for Liberia, I think that is a really, really fantastic example of actually incorporating integrity, humility into practice, along with these other really vital attributes. So we've talked a lot about leading and leadership, but the title of this webinar also includes following. And I wonder if we could shift for a moment and think about these motivations that we have, especially in academic programs where many of us live, in developing and cultivating leaders. Followers are vitally important in the ecosystem as well. I wonder if we could take some moments to think about, what does it mean to follow? How do you balance the following and leading tendencies that we might have at different times, and how might we see that play out in global health? in no particular order, so jump on in. Sten, you're smiling, so why
No,
don't
I
you
like it when Andrea goes first, but I guess I shouldn't have smiled because now I'm stuck. In academia, in business, in government, in the nonprofit sector, we always are facing change. We're always facing new technologies. When I started working on malaria many years ago, we did not have GIS systems. We didn't have much in the way of satellite imaging. We didn't have much in the way of molecular strategies for identifying vectors or infected vectors. I mean, there was just a lot of technological advances that came in the first years when I was working on malaria. And I constantly had to learn and follow. And I think that now we're coping with COVID-19. And I'm learning from some of my younger colleagues about how social media can be used as research tools, how smartphones can be used as GPS devices, how we can study networks of people through the relatively passive acquisition of incidentally collected data. Things that I could have only dreamed about when I was younger. And in those rooms, I am definitely a follower. I'm definitely a learner. And there are others who are leading because of their technological competence. I think that Richard alluded to this, that sometimes others will lead because of their cultural competence and social awareness of a particular society or particular subgroup within society or particular neighborhood. And our devotion to community consultation is very much steeped in that level of humility and willingness to be followers. Nothing is more disagreeable than some NGO leader or some academic leader, some government leader coming and telling the community what to do. We do so much better with community consultation, participatory engagement, because the decisions we make and the programs that we develop are inevitably more tuned to community needs because we've bothered to listen to the community. So I feel like the following is an everyday event. It's not like, oh, this time in my career I was a follower and now I'm a leader. You're leading, following, you're teaching, learning. And that's kind of what I meant when I said that, you want to do better the next day than you did yesterday. And if that's your attitude, you will be a follower and you will learn a lot.
Wonderful, really thoughtful contributions. Andrea, hoping that that your bandwidth works in our favor.
Yes, well, I do think that following is you have to follow what's happening. With running transport for health, all about global health. I just knew I'd seen they in Labour because there was no transport, so I knew there were terrible gaps. About global health. Say that I'm glad I wouldn't know that if I hadn't have been very keen to listen and learn and listen to the strategies of ministries of health and how they were reaching their populations, and listening to the way in which the leadership in each country. May I announce my my interest and love of Liberia too while we're at it. And so we do, as Stan says, have to listen and learn, and if we didn't do that as leaders, we'd be very poor leaders, and we wouldn't be able to build strategies either. So, and we wouldn't be able to face abilities of other people make a difference to the work that we do. So I and learners and teachers and leaders and followers.
Wonderful. You broke up slightly, but certainly the strongest takeaway was one that was incredibly wise around teaching and learning, leading and following, and the importance of being both. And that obviously brings us back to humility and integrity so nicely. Richard, any additional thoughts on following and what does it mean? And maybe even back to Andrea's point around the challenges regarding being viewed as weak. And in cultural settings where weakness is defined differently, interpreted differently, how are you a follower and not perceived as weak, or perceived as weak and that be something that's a real strength in terms of marrying a number of different attributes and sensibilities to be effective?
Again, it's very difficult to build on the thoughtful comments that have already been made, but maybe I could try with just a couple of stories. As I mentioned, I think it's always important to really understand what your strengths are, and at the same time to appreciate enormously the point that Andrea and Sten have made, which is in order to lead, you have to be a really good follower. You have to be a really good listener. You have to be a really good learner. So one, if I may, just two very brief vignettes. Recently, one of my friends at the Yale School of Medicine and Public Health asked me to teach a session for him. He's an extraordinarily gracious gentleman. And he introduced me to his students in the class I used to teach at the business school at Yale, as School of Management. He introduced me as one of the leading authorities in the world on maternal and child health, a subject on which I was going to speak. And I said to the students that I was deeply, deeply moved by the gracious introduction of my friend. But the students should understand I was absolutely not one of the leading authorities in the world on maternal and child health. However, I said, wagging my finger on video, my friends are the leading authorities in the world on maternal and child health. And my friends agree that I am the leading authority in the world on paraphrasing the leading authorities. And I think that represents well what Andrea and Sten were saying. I'm not going to try to pretend to be Bob Black or Stan Vermund or Andrea Coleman Wendy Graham. What I hope to do is learn from them and then help young students to learn by clearly and simply re-articulating their most important messages and help to create environments where students can embody them, be inspired by them, and want to become the Stens and Andreas of the future. One of the things I regularly tell my students to do is not take jobs in organizations that are too small. Student will excitedly come and say, you know, there's great organization. They're going to give me an enormous amount of responsibility right out of my first degree program, and I'm going to take the job. And almost always, always I discourage them from doing so, because much, as I mentioned earlier, of who you are later and at all times will depend on the people with whom you learn. Big organizations might have too many people, but an organization with 3 people isn't going to teach that much to a really, really, really smart recent graduate. It's imperative, by contrast, I think, that they find an organization where they can learn constantly from a wider array of people from a more diverse set of backgrounds. And the last thing, and this is a little bit harsh, but I think it's kind of cute. You know, some undergrads, especially at some kinds of universities, aren't very humble, and some of the institutions don't necessarily breed humility. So one of the things that I always tried to do was, in a nice way, especially for the students I knew best, was to encourage them from very early on to understand who they were in life. So I hope I won't be beat up for this 2-second vignette, but I had a student come to me, and this was typical. And she said, you know, Uncle Professor Skolnick, and this was a student I knew exceedingly well and was one of my adopted nieces, could you please review a cover letter I've written for applying for a job at Professor Vermon's laboratory at the National Institute of Health. And I would say, of course, Marie, it's my honor to do that. And I would look at it and I'd say, you know, Marie, because you're my adopted niece, because I love you so much, I'm going to take this and I'm going to rip it into 101 pieces in front of you. Then I'm going to make you get down on your hands and knees, because Professor Vermont is a Nobel Prize winner in biology or in medicine. And your cover note to him begins by saying, "Dear Professor Vermont, I'm writing to apply for summer job XYZ. Let me begin by saying what I can bring to your laboratory." And this is consistent. I would see this all the time. And I would say, "So Marie, again, only because I love you so much, how old are you?" 18 and a half. You know, let me just say, you're a young woman of extraordinary intelligence. And I know that you will someday be running the world, and I'm going to do all I can to help you get there. Right now, you are nothing. You're absolutely nothing. You know nothing. You are nothing, but you're at the beginning of a very promising career, provided you understand your place in the universe and the humility with which you must treat yourself and everybody else. I want to encourage you to begin your letter by saying, "Dear Professor Vermont, there is nothing in the world that would make me happier than the remarkable opportunity to work in your laboratory and learn from you this summer." I'm not suggesting everybody should treat all their adopted nieces and nephews or other students like that, but I think it's really imperative that for people who've achieved positions that allow them to mentor young people, that we help those young students from the get-go to understand these concepts. And there'll be some who are so in love with themselves that they don't get it. But most kids, I think, through good mentoring like that, I think it's good, through tough but good, and none of them ever cried, boy or girls, they all thank me. I think if you get them at the right stage, except for the ones who are so narcissistic and so in love with themselves and so believing, one can do a real service and help students early on to understand that and who they are with respect to both NIH and the librarians in a way that can really help enable them later to become good leaders.
Mm. So Richard started us off with kind of some closing words of wisdom and how to think about messaging the next generation and understanding that we have a role in cultivating those leaders, either through tough love, through skill building, through opportunities to model these practices ourselves. And I'll ask Andrea and Sten in the final 2 minutes to just give us some parting pieces of wisdom, as Richard did from your own experiences. You know, what might you recommend as a piece of advice for those who are building their leadership skills, growing as leaders in this space, or perfecting them for those who are already in those positions?
Thank you, Marie. And I find it hard. Find it hard to follow Richard and stand on. I think that one of the things I would really like to advise people to do, having standards and having a position and a position of integrity is one thing, but it can be sorely tested at times. You know, when you're in the heat of the moment and when you're really facing some issues, really find someone that you trust to talk to. Don't be humble enough to say, I am really stuck, I'm the leader of this great organization or something, but talk to someone, because it's great to have standards and integrity, but it is hard sometimes. Life's really hard. So don't feel you can't go and talk to someone and say, this is a moment of weakness for me. I'm not the great leader that everybody thinks I am. I need to talk to you. Can you help me? So that's my advice.
Fantastic. Great. Sten, any last words?
I'm going to refer to the COVID-19 pandemic that we find ourselves in the middle of. And there is a framework that I learned about from a colleague, and they have a name for it: adaptive leadership. Mm. And that posits that for new challenges, the problem and solution cannot possibly be known by a single actor. And an essential role of a leader is to ask the right questions so that the group, the team, can uncover the sort of adaptive challenges and solve them together. So looking at COVID-19, I am not the world's expert at indoor air quality and how to reduce coronavirus transmission indoors, but I have people on my faculty who are. I'm not the guru on how precisely to operationalize a practical and effective environmental cleansing protocol, but there are people in our custodial and buildings and grounds team and in our union who are experts. There are, I'm not an expert in mask technologies, but there's a lot in the literature, and I know enough to be dangerous and to read that literature and educate myself and then consult. There are issues around public transportation. There are issues around how the arts can reboot and renew, be it drama or museums or music events and the like. There are issues around how schools can reopen safely. There are issues around how Yale University can reopen safely. So I find myself in an adaptive leadership mode where, based on 40 years in infectious disease epidemiology, I have some knowledge base about what I don't know. And I'm in a position to broker that knowledge and translate it, and what Richard said a moment ago, translate it to others. And I loved what Andrea said about alluding to a confidant, someone you can talk to, somebody you can relate to about the challenges, and not necessarily somebody in your workplace, but somebody you can bounce ideas off of. That can be absolutely invaluable when there is some uncertainty and you're able to just hear your point of view through someone else's prism. So those would be just some thoughts for your audience.
Fantastic. Well, I know we've gone a few minutes over, but I think it was worth it. Thanks to Sten, Richard, and Andrea for your great information, insight, expertise, contributions to global health. What a fantastic panel. I feel really inspired and humbled to have been a part of it. So thank you all for allowing this, and for Unite for Sight for making this opportunity possible. I'd encourage you all to look at all of their many webinars that they're hosting now to continue to grow and build your own tools and skill sets to be effective in global health. Thank you all.